Hello everyone, and welcome to Theme 3 on the politics of philanthropy. Over the next few weeks, Cyandra, Juniper, Catriel, and I will be sharing our thoughts on the themes that were highlighted by this set of readings, and moderating group discussions on some of the questions that were raised in the articles. Before we delve into the readings, I wanted to give you an idea of how our group has structured our presentations. We begin today with Presentation 1, Philanthropy Policy Making and its Impact on Governance. In this presentation, Cyandra and I will cover some of the key themes raised in the first 3 readings by Diane Stone and Michael Morin, and Robin Rogers. We will also present 4 questions for further discussion in the forum, which will be moderated from today until the end of day on Friday, October 21st. You are, of course, welcome to share your thoughts after this time. However, the professor has noted that no postings are expected during reading week, and the forum will not be moderated during this time. On October 30th, Juniper and Catriel will post their presentation on Public Health as Philanthropy Policy Making in Action, which focuses on the final 3 readings of this theme. This presentation will consider philanthropy policy making through the lens of public health. They will contrast the roles that corporations and foundations have assumed in global philanthropy, with a focus on legitimacy, transparency, and accountability of these non-state actors. A further 4 discussion questions will be posted, with the forum being moderated from October 30th until November 1st. Finally, we will summarize the group's discussions in a recap video to be posted on November 2nd. With the administrative details out of the way, I'd like to now turn to Presentation 1, entitled Philanthropy Policy Making and its Impact on Governance. In this presentation, I'll begin by defining one of the key themes this week, philanthropy policy making, and contrasting it to philanthropy capitalism. I'll then move into part 2 of the presentation, which asks, how do philanthropic foundations influence policy decisions? Following this, Cyandra will cover the question of what the impact of philanthropy policymaking actually is, and ask whether there's a need for new philanthropic infrastructure. Some of the key themes of the readings this week are how philanthropic foundations can impact government policymaking, the extent to which these foundations do have an impact, and the question of whether this trend is legitimate or not. Before we jump into these questions, however, it is important to define the term philanthropy policymaking and differentiate it from philanthropy capitalism. This is one of the central arguments of Robin Rogers' reading, Why Philanthropy Policymaking Matters. Rogers argues that a tendency to conflate philanthropy policymaking and philanthropy capitalism means that skeptics and proponents of philanthropy capitalism tend to focus on 2 different questions. While advocates of philanthropy capitalism concentrate on how to increase the impact and effectiveness of philanthropic funds, critics of the trend have often written about the undemocratic nature of foundations' influence on government agendas and policymaking power. As a result, Rogers notes that there's a lack of recognition of the importance of the latter issue by proponents of philanthropy capitalism. So how can we separate these terms? Well, Rogers usefully differentiates between them, arguing that philanthropy capitalism is the use of business tools and market forces, especially by the very wealthy, for the greater social good. She further breaks down the term into 3 parts. First, philanthropy capitalism is about money, meaning that the rich should use some of their wealth for the betterment of society. Secondly, philanthropy capitalism is about markets, suggesting that philanthropy should use market forces and financing tools to determine which programs are most effective and increase impact. And finally, philanthropy capitalism is about measurement, which means that foundations must gather data on outcomes and analyze their effectiveness in order to ensure that funds are used strategically to maximize impact. Rogers also suggests that a 4th criterion, management, might also be added to this definition. However, in one of the article's gaps, she does not define what is meant by this. John Cassidy, a writer at the New Yorker, may provide an answer when he suggests that part of the philanthropy capitalism trend involves billionaires who not only donate money, but want to direct it to specific causes through their own foundations. In other words, they want to manage how their donations are spent. A key example of philanthropy capitalism in action is one that Rogers gives. This is the Giving Pledge, which requests that billionaires commit to donating over half of their wealth to philanthropic causes. Today, over 170 billionaires in 21 countries have made this promise, including Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who has pledged to donate 99% of his Facebook shares during his lifetime. Now, prior to leaving the philanthrocapitalism discussion, I would like to add that it's important to recognize that there is a debate about the question of whether this trend is significantly different from traditional philanthropy. For example, while it could be argued that the aforementioned characteristics of philanthrocapitalism differentiate them from traditional philanthropy, older groups like the Rockefeller Foundation also believed in the application of business practices to philanthropy, as Dr. Lindsay McGoey notes in Philanthrocapitalism, the Gates Foundation, and Global Health. Or consider Morin and Stone's definition of philanthrocapitalism. They appear to agree with Rogers' definition in large part, noting that hallmarks of philanthrocapitalism include a market orientation, the use of business tools, and an emphasis on performance measurement. However, they add that non-financial support, such as receiving access to networks, is another important aspect of philanthrocapitalism. This recognizes that money is not the only resource that donees require in order to be successful. However, relationship-based allocation of resources is a marker of traditional philanthropy, as suggested by Maximilian Martin in the introductory readings for this class, when he argued that philanthropy was moving away from a relationship-driven allocation of money towards one that was influenced by the actual effectiveness of programs. Thus, the suggestion that access to networks remains an important part of philanthrocapitalism, despite its shift towards measurement, raises questions as to how different philanthrocapitalism actually is from traditional philanthropy. My thoughts here are not meant to provide a definitive position on the debate either way, but simply to raise the point that this debate does exist. However, since the focus of our presentation is philanthropic policy making primarily, I'm now going to shift the focus of this presentation to this smaller subset of philanthrocapitalism. Philanthropic policy making is a subset of philanthrocapitalism, as I noted, and it can be used to describe the agenda-setting power and influence of philanthropists on public policy. To illustrate this point, Rogers uses the example of the Good Club, where billionaires meet behind closed doors to discuss and strategize which causes to support and how best to resolve them. Morin and Stone argue that this phenomenon is not a new one. For example, they recognize that the Rockefeller Foundation played an important role in the creation of the League of Nations Health Organization, as well as the WHO. However, these authors also argue that new trends have increased its relative impact. These include an increase in private aid funding, the spread of tools like public-private partnerships, and disillusionment with governmental approaches to development. Rogers presents a slightly different argument, suggesting that the increase in income equality has raised the influence of the few, catalyzing a wider accountability problem. For these reasons, the authors feel that philanthropic policy making is a concerning issue that should be addressed. And this leads us to the first discussion question. In your opinion, is philanthropic policy making a new phenomenon? Why or why not? And if not, how is philanthropic policy making different today given our increasingly globalized world? Now, having differentiated between philanthrocapitalism and philanthropic policy making, it's now possible to consider the question of how philanthropists influence public policy. First, the material power of philanthropists lends them significant economic influence. This can impact public policy making both directly and indirectly. Directly, the size of philanthropist donations to public causes means that they often have a seat at the policy-making table and are able to determine which projects receive funding, thus shaping the international response to an issue during both the problem definition and resolution stages. As an illustration, Jens Martens and Carolyn Seitz have written an excellent paper demonstrating how philanthropic organizations have had a significant influence on agricultural development strategies. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation have shaped the field so that it focuses on the use of technology and the creation of markets as the key means by which to increase agricultural productivity and reduce hunger. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done so in part through their over $3 billion in funding for agricultural development. These grants can create a client-based relationship between the foundation and its donees, influencing what the donees are willing to say and do. For example, consider the Bill chill effect, which describes a situation where those funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations may be reluctant to criticize them. A recent article by social scientist Daniel Dresner echoes this concern when he notes the following. He says, The trouble with social scientists studying philanthropic foundations is that social scientists are also funded and will continue to seek funding by such philanthropies. This fact can make researching them super awkward. Now, such conflicts of interest, also demonstrated in Shaw's ExxonMobil article, do not necessarily mean that there will not be opposition to a certain strategy, but it does make it more difficult for grantees to speak up and allows philanthropies to more easily shape their understandings of international problems and to adopt the strategies that seem most impactful from their perspective. Add this to the fact that philanthropists can create new venues for discussion of the issues and create places for themselves at the table. As Martins and Seitz note, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation helped create forums for discussion and action on the issue of agricultural development, such as the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa or the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. Importantly, these authors note that key members of the Gates Foundation have positions on the boards of both of these groups, so they influence programs and policies through both money and management. Philanthropists can also use their economic power to sway public opinion and influence public policy more indirectly. Consider, for example, Participant Media Studios, which was founded by billionaire Jeff Skoll for the purpose of impacting social change. It is Participant Studios that funded An Inconvenient Truth, a film that some surveys have suggested influenced 66% of respondents to change their opinions on global warming, and, at the very least, helped put climate change on the policy-making agenda. In this case, the cause being supported by philanthropy is something that I think most of us would agree is an important issue. However, if Jeff Skoll had been a climate skeptic, we might feel otherwise. Now, Diane Stone argues that philanthropic foundations can also influence public policy as norm brokers. They do so by diffusing norms that help to regulate behavior or even constitute the very identities of domestic actors. Norms can vary in clarity, from the transferal of best practices like the adoption of quarterly economic indicators in Eastern Europe, to fuzzier norms like the rule of law that are supported by the Open Society Institute and which some argue was one of the key influencers behind the Orange Revolutions in Eastern Europe. However, the fuzziness of many norms means that some scholars in the field of international relations, a field from which Stone gathers many of her references, argue that it can be difficult to actually determine and prove that an international actor's attempts to spread a norm have had a causal impact. For example, Stone does not provide much evidence of the OSI's possible role in the Orange Revolutions to back up her argument that norms can have a counter-hegemonic impact. In particular, she does not consider alternative explanations for the Orange Revolutions. Despite the weakness in this article, there are a number of international relations studies, like Nina Tannenwald's study of nuclear taboo, for instance, who have engaged in systematic case studies to demonstrate the impact of international norms, suggesting that norms do matter. Still, this does not mean that norms that are espoused by foundations will matter all of the time. Stone rightly notes that norms can vary in terms of the extent to which they're accepted. For example, a norm could be adopted as a whole, it could be adopted in a localized fashion, or it could be rejected by norm takers. The agency of norm takers adds veracity to Stone's argument that the policy transfer by philanthropic organizations is non-coercive because it cannot force acceptance of its policy ideas. That being said, Stone's point that westernized professionals have greater access to civil society and thus greater influence on transnational policy spaces and a greater opportunity to determine which norms are spread does raise the question of whether the diffusion of these norms by philanthropic foundations is a legitimate means of influencing societies or simply another form of cultural hegemony. Thus, our second discussion question will be, to what extent should philanthropic institutions try to impact public policy through normative change? Is this form of influence more or less legitimate than other means of impacting public policy? And having outlined a few of the ways by which philanthropists can influence public policy, the importance of the issue is clear. For Robin Rogers, the key problem that arises from philanthropic policymaking is one of accountability, and this will be dealt with comprehensively in our second presentation. However, in an article that reacts to Roger's argument, Michael Edwards suggests that important questions and challenges around the impact of philanthropic capitalism demand further investigation. It is the impact of philanthropic capitalism and philanthropy in general that Cyandra will now speak about.
Hi everyone, this is cyandra.carvalho, and I'm going to be taking over from Sarah's presentation on philanthropic policymaking. I'll be looking at the impact on primarily governance and what we can look at in terms of new infrastructure. So when we look at what philanthropic policymaking is, we see that one of the primary impacts of transnational philanthropy as a vehicle and of philanthropic capitalism has been the promotion of the transnationalization of policy. This idea has really been culminated most strongly in the phenomenon of philanthropic policymaking. How is that done? Primarily, people consider philanthropic policymaking through the lens of funding, but really the vehicles of policy influence that we can see within philanthropic policymaking include quite a varied number of things. And that includes coalitions, partnerships, and shared policy dialogues. All of this comes together to produce a kind of mandate or a distinct and driven policy agenda under which a philanthropic organization can operate. Once we take this distinct policy agenda and add the idea of partnerships of significance, by which I mean partnerships that can enforce policies such as governments, ministries, or interstate bodies, we begin to see the formation of a philanthropic organization that is, 1, able to influence policymaking, and 2, willing to exercise this ability. Moving on to whether or not this is a new or old exertion of influence, the key here is to keep in mind this idea of the transnationalization of policymaking. I want to emphasize here that the transnational in this context does not just mean policymaking between two states, but it can also mean between a state and any non-local, non-state actor. So then, further examining this growing phenomenon of globalized policy making, we see that the transnationalization of policy is not really so much of a new phenomenon as much as it is a pre-existing trend to which philanthropic policy making is simply adding a new facet to as a non-state actor. To simplify, the old adage of money equals power, which equals influence, still holds true. To put this in perspective, I'd like to bring some of the headline news from yesterday morning into play. It was announced yesterday morning that George Soros donated a very generous $18 billion to the Open Source Foundation. $18 billion. But just for us to understand the capacity of this tool, I want us to recognize that this amount of money, $18 billion, means that the Open Source Foundation now has more money at its disposal than the entire nation of Senegal, Laos, or Nicaragua. In terms of development perspectives, that means that the Open Source Foundation currently has 3 times the operating budget of the entire UN system in 2016. So, as we consider that kind of colossal impact, or the possibility for colossal impact, it becomes easy to see why it's important to examine the impacts of such power. Its ability to influence policy cannot be undermined, and its classification as a non-state actor may in fact be slightly misleading, leading us more to perceive philanthropic influence as diluted, weaker, niched, or somehow less coercive or impactful than that of state-based actors. All of this leads us to a question of whether philanthropic policymaking is simply a revision of classical political lobbying, or whether there's perhaps an added veil of altruism to this question. What is the impact of philanthropic policymaking? Is it producing positives or negatives? Is it producing genuine global public goods, or is it further embedding a system of global public bads? At which intersections do these goods and bads appear? And as always, we have to question for whom and to whom these goods and bads are occurring. This brings us to our next slide. To set us up for a strong and comprehensive debate on this topic, and in order to, as much as possible, keep our own biases out of the discussion, our group has decided to look at both the benefits and drawbacks of philanthropic policymaking through the lens of the impact at 4 different levels. These 4 levels will be the beneficiary level, the donee country level, the donor level, and the level of the global aid system. Beginning with the beneficiary level, we'll look first at the drawbacks. So when we're talking about beneficiaries, I want us to consider not beneficiaries as simply participants in a program, but rather as individuals with a sense of agency that can and should be exercised within its own governance system. Bearing that in mind, we have to wonder whether philanthropic policymaking may effectively rob whatever little agency minorities have built up by inserting a default mouthpiece that may or may not accurately reflect the lived experience of that minority. By that, what we mean is that the expertise of a philanthropic organization may in fact become the default narrative of a minority group, and in doing so, it may rob the voice of that minority group, such that the minority group is no longer able to speak for itself. We see this quite often in the case of refugee narratives, where various organizations are involved in refugee protection, and as such, the refugee narrative itself can sometimes be highly misconstrued. The second drawback that we've seen is that it once again places the agenda of development issues in the hands of those communities that have access to funding and resources which are not necessarily representative of vulnerability or of needs. For those who actually are in those communities that do present a high level of vulnerability or a high level of need, that agency of being able to represent their need as strongly as it is felt may not be possible due to an overemphasis on other communities being placed by philanthropic organizations. So those are the drawbacks. What are the benefits? The benefits towards an individual agency are that philanthropic policymaking organizations may in fact enhance the representation of those minorities who are otherwise unable to exercise agency. So by this we mean that philanthropic organizations may in fact act as intermediaries. For example, Cambodian prostitute women were unable to actually exercise any of their protection rights or engage in conversation with governance structures or law enforcement individuals. By inserting this intermediary, prostitutes were able to retain their anonymity while at the same time being able to engage in conversations at a higher level and retain for themselves some amount of rights, some amount of protections, and change their situation and relationship to local governance. A second benefit is that it may provide minority communities with an alternative system through which to seek agency, resources, and capacity building. This is especially true in the initial stages of growth. Moving along to the next slide, the next impact level, we have donee countries. Donee countries present an interesting conundrum. What we'll be looking at primarily is the governance and infrastructure aspects and how philanthropic policymaking can impact governance and infrastructure. The first drawback is that it can act as a shadow platform for governance services and can undermine fledgling governance structures by drawing talent, funding, and resources away from local governance bodies. In this case, we can see that it might not necessarily push local governments to take governments to take responsibility for their own jurisdictions. An organization who works primarily in healthcare, for example, may draw talented healthcare policymakers away from local health ministries, or in fact may create a secondary system whereby local governments no longer feel that they need to invest in the infrastructure to develop stronger health infrastructure. The second drawback is that the presumed authority and legitimacy of non-state actors may in fact subvert real authority and legitimacy of local governments. The benefits to donor countries include that it encourages and opens the pathway to genuine dialogue between minority groups and governance structures. The growth of capacity in this field can also mean that local governments can benefit from pre-existing institutional capacity within philanthropic organizations and are better able to avoid pitfalls that can lead to policy failure. So this is a classic situation of best practices being shared, overall do's and don'ts of governance being implemented. So moving on to the next impact level, we have donors. When we look at donors, the drawbacks to donors themselves, to philanthropic organizations themselves, of engaging in philanthropic policymaking, is that the presumption of non-state actors as dispassionate or scientific or unbiased parties may mean that those same donors, the policy blind of those same donors may go entirely unchecked, and they themselves may be unaware of what their policy blinds and biases might be. The second is that it allows the agenda of the entire civil society sector to be dictated by a small select elite of philanthropic organizations that may or may not be representative of the realities on the ground. Moving to the benefits, we see that for philanthropic organizations, engaging in philanthropic policymaking allows them to maintain a possible neutral third-party status. It keeps them able to exercise legal and financial independence and keeps them free of constraints of party platforms or voter ransoms. It can also maintain a global niche for corporate survival in the civil sector or in the development sector. This is especially important given the current shrinking UN system and the overall global shrinking development system. We see less and less funding occurring within the UN system and within the development system. And as such, the need for private sector engagement has been strongly endorsed. So, our last impact level is that of global aid systems. Here we look at first the increased possibility of inappropriate development models or a mismatch of experience. Now, in the Stone article, we've seen an attempt to respond to this critique where the Open Source Foundation has endorsed the concept of east-to-east communication and east-to-east knowledge transfer. But that doesn't quite respond to the issue of diversity within circumstances and the range of diversity within circumstances, both historical and economic. Now, this is true both in the East-to-East context as well as in the South-to-South dialogue. The second drawback is that by unifying a singular mandate that dictates funding, operations, policy, dialogue, and norms around the world, philanthropic organizations can produce the same negative outcomes as public versions of the same aid systems, i.e. the Bretton Woods system. Lastly, it also enhances the incestuous nature of development work, whereby once again, philanthropic organizations who are at the topmost levels retain the power to set the agenda while dispersing the money and providing for puppet representation. This leaves very little room for disruption or innovation in any kind of policy making. One of the benefits of philanthropic policy making to the global policy aid and development systems are the distinct creation and momentum of a global development agenda, which can counter cultural relativity and entrench human rights norms and baselines across the globe. An example of this is on the issues of female genital mutilation, women's rights, and indigenous issues. A second Another benefit, which I think is the largest benefit of all, is that this new landscape points us to a huge opportunity where the entire development system is able to look at how we can reconfigure the aid system writ large. The philanthropic community is really now presented with the chance to carve out this new transnational space for public action. But the question that remains in my mind is, what does this new space look like, and how would it be regulated? If we look at the infrastructure that's been in place before, especially around the aid system, we see a very highly regulated system, a system which enjoys a significant amount of checks and balances. So how do we do this in this new transnational space? That brings us to our second last slide. Brand new world, a brand new landscape. Part of the Rogers article references is blurring and broken boundaries. The blurring and broken boundaries that make the current divide between business and charity almost impossible to sustain. When I read this line, the first thing that came to mind was, why exactly are we trying to sustain this model? It hasn't necessarily produced any, you know, any significant gains that we can say can't be replicated by another model. So that begs the question of, does this new transnational space point to the possibility of a different model? And is there a need for new infrastructure to fill that model? And if so, what would it look like? Bearing that in mind, then, we can see that there is a clear need for new philanthropic infrastructure, which can better support the integration of private sector needs, or of the private sector in addressing development needs. So all of this leads us to our final question of question number 3. Is the current model of conventional philanthropy policymaking the most effective or impactful way for the private sector philanthropists to invest in mobilizing social change? Why or why not? And the last question is, can you envision a new or alternative infrastructure that could better utilize the role of philanthropists in policymaking? What shape could this infrastructure take? Thanks so much for taking the time to look through our presentation. We hope to see all of you in a very lively and insightful forum exchange, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this issue. Have a great week. Bye.